That's what I've been trying to say, yeah.
As promised, card number 12. Nibe, Kimigwich, Migo, Nibe, Wenja and Daso, Yujik da, Nondabin, Nondamini, Nondaminiquayan. Nondaminiquayan. Ready? Kimigwich, Migo, Kimigwich, Migo, Nibe, Wenja, and Daso, Yujik da, Nondaminiquayan. So, and we thank you for the water because each day we need to drink. And I'm sure this is true of most traditions, but we have a special place for that beautiful, pure, crystal clean water in the way that we think about the world as Anishinaabe people. So, with that, I'll turn it over to all of the people who need no introduction. But just in case somebody hasn't been here the last little bit, we have Jennifer Denetdale from New Mexico, University of New Mexico. Kennan Ferguson from right here at UW-M. We have Audra Simpson from Columbia. Sorry. TallBear from Edmonton, University of Alberta. And Jolene Rickard from Cornell.
Thank you. And I hope people who have the entire collection of 12 cards, that shows that you have had some incredible presence over the past 2.5 days. So there are not many people with a full collection, so hold on to it. It's a very valuable, complete set. I'd like to thank all the artists, and you will notice that the images on the front of the card are also the ones on the art piece out in the hallway, which Bernie talked about a little bit yesterday morning. I also, before anything else, want to thank the people who, if it has seemed as though this conference has gone off without a hitch, are responsible for that not entirely true image, but who have really made it seem seamless to those of us who've been enjoying this. First, Allie Sperling. To John Bloom, who's been been in charge of the technical work. To Annette Hess, who has coordinated everything. Applause. Tellem, who is our PA, who is listening to us from upstairs, where he has been running the video. Yeah, oh, he's up in the We are sadly losing him to the University of Virginia, where he's going to be doing his PhD next semester. So, the tradition at the Center for 21st Century Studies is at the end to decompress, not with a extensive set of conclusory ideas, but with a chance for a variety of people to talk about how the experience has been for them, the relationship between in the audience's background and the things that we've been talking about, a chance for the plenary speakers to unbury the hidden resentments against one another. That's only happened a couple of times, but it's always very exciting. And for us to have a general analysis of the whole experience of the past 2.5 days. So I'd first like to invite any of the plenary speakers to say whatever few words they have about what's gone on, what they felt, what they've agreed with, disagreed with, whether or not they like Milwaukee. Secret, they do. And then to open it up to the wonderful people who've been part of this whole process.
I want to thank the Center for 21st Century Studies and Ken Ferguson for inviting me to be a part of this wonderful several days. It really is incredible to get this chance to be once again with the Indigenous Mothership. I met these incredible scholars years ago when we were developing as a group. People came and went, but we had developed working groups on Indigenous feminisms, and we've worked and we've developed and moved into different kinds of directions where we continue to have conversations and we continue to build upon the work in critical Indigenous studies and Indigenous feminisms and queer critique. And so I'm really glad and proud to be a part of this group. So.
Well, co-sign that. This has been quite an honor for me and a pleasure, and I really am quite fond of Milwaukee and would happily come back here. This is an incredible scene you have. For me, intellectually, I think one of the most exciting threads that I saw running through much of the work here is the attention paid to life forms that are other than human. And I saw that coursing through our papers, but also I saw this in threads during some of the papers that I was fortunate enough to attend in the breakout sessions. So this might be something that we can either talk about now. I'm thirsting for a martini, but we could talk about, I'd like to talk about olives, but we can either talk about that now, or, because this might be something we might have something to say about, to, or with, against, whatever this, the Jane Bennett School, et cetera, what Kim was talking about in her paper, which she opened up for us, this other literature, what Zoe Todd and Audra Mitchell are up to, critiquing this fetishization of the Anthropocene. So that might be thematically something we can hammer at. Again, I don't have the energy right now, but it's something that I noted, and I'd also like to, in the spirit of careful, critical, celebratory moments, like really, I have to say, Kennan and his posse here have assembled 4 women in Indigenous studies, and this is unusual. So just to let you know that it's not just that we are the bodies of women, we're also representing, and I think we're called cis women maybe, I don't know, but we also, when somebody called us power femmes too, which we liked then. But we also represent, I think, modalities within Indigenous studies that are have been forming, are emergent. Jennifer's making reference to that, and we're also committed to political, cultural, and gender theory. So if we're the only thing you know of Indigenous studies, I have to tell you that's a very interesting way to know our field. So good on you, Kennan. Smuggler.
Gosh, let's see. Kennan came to visit me in Austin last year when I was at the University of Texas, and I'd never met him before, and I don't run in political science areas at all. But I thought that he had some interesting ideas and kind of got what I was talking about, and we had a great conversation. And I am a person who operates out of obligations. That's just how I am. Once I make a connection with somebody and they become part of my extended family, then I am loyal to that, and so that's why I came here, even though I didn't really know what I was getting into. But when I saw the program, I thought, oh, I've got very collegial thinkers there as well with me, whose work I really respect. Jolene I hadn't met before, and I have just as much intellectual, I think, connection with you as I do with Audra and Jennifer, whose work I also really appreciate. And I was interested to see how all the cross-fertilization connections that happen, and of course we didn't plan that at all, right? We kind of all presented new work that we haven't heard each other do before. So that was really pretty special to me. I was going to say something else, but I kind of forgot right now. Oh, so this is really interesting to be here at this time. I'm 47 this year, and this is the year that this is the year I suddenly moved into that next stage of life. Like I don't know, maybe other women know, I don't know what year it was for you. The 40s are the best decade, but they're just wonderful. But this is the year that I'm mature. Like I have some minor health, but addressable health problems, which I've never had before. But it's also, there's something else going on, and it's also coming into some space intellectually, which that's why I really appreciated being with these other women, moving into a space where you're kind of moving into being a senior scholar. That's really interesting. And I'm humbled to have made it that far. I'm grateful for the people that came before me, really, really grateful for my intellectual elders, which include not only my people with PhDs, but my mother was the first theorist who really kind of paved the way for me. And so this space has felt a little bit like has signified that the shift that has happened this year. And I think probably that's also because there's some really amazing younger Indigenous studies scholars here who are doing really critical, important work. 5 years ago, there was nobody else doing Indigenous science studies as far as I could tell, and now I see all these younger people who are much more well-read than me and just moving along really quickly and are going to help. And we need to do Indigenous science studies because that's the front line of defending Indigenous peoples, is by pushing back against colonial science and technology. And so I'm really happy to see people moving in that way, and that includes environmental politics as well. So it's been really, really nice to be here.
Well, I agree with everything that's been said so far, and I really appreciate the invitation to come. And it's true that I didn't know Kim, and it's really interesting to get to know her a little and her work. I'd like to thank Kennan for assembling us. What I'm struck by in this gathering, and lately, the talk about milestones. Lately, I've been like the oldest person on a number of panels that I've been at, and so that's kind of a unique experience for me. And I'm not sure that it means anything except that I've had 2 careers, and so I'm not suggesting that intellectually more advanced. I'm only suggesting that as far as age is concerned, I've been around a while. And one of the things I'm struck by is the difference between when I began this work and where we're at now, and how there's actually this field of Indigenous studies, because most of us began within disciplines. And I think the thing that I'm interested in is seeing how far we can push the disciplinary boundaries, as well as this field, this place that we're beginning to call Indigenous Studies, or that is beginning to really have a sense of cohesion. And it's interesting because in the disciplinary brackets, we all deal with different sets of theorists that need to be, or ideas, or colonialisms expressed in different ways that need to be set in context from our perspective. And I felt like a lot of that work got done here this weekend. Lots of new ideas I thought were circulating. So I think Audra said it best when she said this is a unique entry point into this discussion through our experiences.
I'd like to just point out a couple of things that I've noticed over the past couple of days, maybe some thematic linkages, some of which were completely unexpected to me. One of those was I think, very careful and interesting attention paid to images and their production, their distribution, and in the case of Skye, who is back in the back row back there, their literal reproduction and performance. A second thing, which is, I think, close to many of our hearts, was the emphasis that clearly emerged, though sometimes quietly, about those connections beyond humanity, beyond human relationships to land and to larger collectivities of kinds of being, which are clearly unrepresented or underrepresented in European forms of philosophy. And finally, one that I think Audra's paper really brought this out in a nice rendition of the Sky Woman story. The ways in which, for European political thought, I'm a political theorist, there's this assumption that those actions of politics are something that human beings created. You know, that it's something like writing, where there were a bunch of humans for a long time, and then writing came along and it got spread around. Whereas in a lot of these indigenous epistemologies, especially the ones that I'm a little more familiar with in North America, this idea that the animals have a collectivity and they make decisions, that's the earth as a result of political decisions and procedures, which I think is a very refreshing non-human focus for the ways in which we can think of all sorts of fields that we're in. I'd also like to invite other people in the audience to contribute their own thoughts on this and their own connections that they've made. So if you raise your hand, Cal has a microphone for you. Yeah.
I remembered what I wanted to say before. And so I really so appreciate the healthiness of the community here at the university, in that we were greeted every day by the language of the peoples that understand this place best. And it was not a display or performance of the language, but it was an invitation to participate and learn, which I think there's an intelligence in that as well. And we were hosted with meals that we could all share together, which I think is an indigenous practice. And I feel that the fact that they brought the community in with the students yesterday and looked at the school and looked at the extension of the work that's going on here at the university in the community, and they were able to demonstrate it with this plurality of indigenous students that came and spoke in each of their languages. And Audra and I consistently marveled at the fact that it wasn't a flattening of like one language that was being addressed, but that it was multiple languages, and that it was really significant how they stood up and they were proud and they were able to really share their experience with us. And so I think that all of these things for me like are part of what this intellectual circuit is, that is part of the field that we participate, or we want to participate in, you know, because sometimes I go to these conferences and they want to have a discussion about Indigenous practices, but they don't want to practice anything Indigenous. And so I'd really like to thank you for that.
I want to add to what I just said, and it's really been something that's been on my mind a lot and just thinking through, is that I appreciate Kennan inviting us and putting together this panel and this conference and the other panels to have a conversation. You know, I come into this space of critical Indigenous studies, Indigenous feminisms, after like 25, 30 years of doing this work. And one of the things that troubles me right now is the way in which Indigenous scholars have put out there that critical Indigenous studies is theorizing, and it puts at the center critical Indigenous studies across disciplines. You know, and what does this mean when I don't want people to come into this space and just dabble and then leave? You know, what does it mean to have a background in Native studies and in Indigenous history and cultures, and to really be accountable and responsible, because that continues to be the foundation for the work that I do. You know, so when you come into these spaces and you talk about Indigenous studies as theory, what does that mean and how does it look? You know, and that's been kind of a question I've been thinking about throughout this conference, you know, because it means something to me. It means my life's work. It means my people's lives' work. It means the ongoingness of our tribal nations. You know, so it matters a lot in terms of the work that we do here at the Academy, and that's just been something that I've been thinking about as we do our work.
I'll say something.
I'm also turning 47 this year, so it makes one kind of feel a bit brash and gives you a confidence that perhaps you didn't have 12 months earlier or something. And I think there's also something about coming from the other side of the world that gives you license to feel that you can be perhaps cheeky and ignorant at the same time in the way that you might pose a question. So I'm really keen to hear a little bit. I mean, it's been a really, really remarkable experience for me being here in a space that's been put together in the way that this conference has. But I'm really interested to hear from you guys who are working within Indigenous studies, but also within your own disciplinary spaces, about the pushing out, if you like. Okay, so how is Indigenous studies being understood as not something that's just being cultivated as a group of people speaking to each other, but as forms of scholarship that are going back into disciplinary spaces and having robust discussions with people on the range of terms that you might have if we had a differently put together audience here, for example. So I'm very much aware that this is an Indigenous Studies conference, not an anthropology conference, for example. And if it had been put together differently, perhaps some of the discussions may have been a little bit differently inflected as well. So, I mean, that's a question as someone who works in Australia as an anthropologist, but also very much in a space of Indigenous studies, and as a white woman, that I'm really interested to have with you people, I suppose.
This is interesting. So I actually have a piece coming out in a critical Indigenous Studies book that Aileen Morton Robinson is editing on University of Arizona Press called Dear Indigenous Studies. It's not me, it's you, why I left and what needs to change. And then I just recently relocated to the University of Alberta to an Indigenous Studies program. And I explain in that article, it's a love letter, it's a Dear John letter to Indigenous Studies, but at the end, and I make it a her just because I'm sick and tired of everybody viewing the history of this field as masculinist, right? But saying, you're really the one I want, but you've got to make some changes. And so my other lover, and I use non-monogamy as a metaphor, and that my other lover is anthropology, but he's in a box. Yeah, and he's like my secondary, and so there are great methods in anthropology, right? I mean, very incisive data is rendered by the methods in that field, and I'm interested in using those. I am not interested in being Mrs. Anthropology, right? That is not my identity. I do the intellectual work that I do, and my mother taught me this long before I got a PhD. When I was 4 years old, I said, what does it mean Custer died for your sins? Vine Deloria Jr., right? That's the name of his book that he published in the late 60s. That's how, so Vine and Leanne TallBear are the two most formative theorists for me. I do this work for the reason my mom does her work as an Indigenous planner, as a Dakota planner. I do this in defense of the people, right? And we can have arguments about whether this is the most efficacious way to do that. There's plenty of people out there who don't think it is. But this is what I do. My mom was a planner, my sister does cultural work, my brother develops solar farms, and my other sister's an attorney in DC. We all view as what we do as part of working on behalf of the people, and we all argue that maybe we're doing the best thing and those other ones are like too capitalist or whatever, right? But for me, that's what Indigenous Studies does. It theorizes and builds knowledge in defense of the thriving of Indigenous communities. And I can take some things from these other disciplines, but that is not their project. Their broad project is to gaze upon us like an object. So.
Yeah, and I think sadly, I mean, and you'll see it, often, sadly, and sometimes temporally in the present, anthropology still attempts to speak for us. And I just think that is untenable, in doing this for living people with living, with it's unthinkable, right? It's not cool. It's not acceptable. However, I mean, I am a political anthropologist. I love ethnography. I love reading good ethnography. I appreciate the materiality of it, the commitment, the deep politics and commitment of many excellent ethnographers, but there is that colonial legacy of entrapment, I think, at the level of representation that I push up against, but then Indigenous Studies with this centering and this squaring of Indigenous peoples as theorists, as actors, as, our knowledge systems as central, it changes the analysis, I think, fundamentally. So I have two lovers also, and sometimes one is in the box, and sometimes I put him in the box. Mine is a he. It's not Franz Boas, but and then other times I hop out and move in and out, and so I think there are, and I don't know how you feel about this with history. Like there are these problems with history, and then when I'm with the political theorists, I'm trying to, well, maybe that's my third lover. Maybe I really am polyamorous in some ways, but that they require each other, though. I think, to do a robust analysis of the present, which is my project, is a robust analysis of the present, trying to produce a different historical consciousness. So, and indeed, I agree. I'm also probably viewed as a terrible activist at failure on that count, because there are people who are doing that grounded work, and their bodies are on the line, and my body's like having a martini, So there are different ways of doing, I think, important, good work that can transform, hopefully, these really difficult conditions that we've inherited, and that we can make over differently. So, yeah.
Do we all have to answer this? Okay. Yeah.
So what do you guys say something now?
I can ask a question. It's more like a curiosity. So you're all well-established scholars in your field, Indigenous studies, and you're coming from your own communities. And and you are criticizing this colonial history and colonial power. But at the same time, you're working in academia, and it's an institute of this colonial world. And do you see a kind of conflict of interest? It has its norms, it's a kind of institute. Do you see a conflict of interest? Do you see a kind of paradox in it?
Warm it up.
Well, we're born into the conflict. And so we live in a settler state, and so our entire lives are framed in this way. And so it doesn't matter if you're in the academy or not, you're still dealing with these conditions.
Yeah, I like to say that I'm in here colonizing. I'm going to take some stuff out and go back and build institutions that I want to build. And so there's a lot of resources in here, and I want some of that stuff. So
I'm convinced that I'm stirring some shit up where I am. So I'm content with that, actually. I think I've pedagogically done some good work with students that I couldn't have done. Like, I think there is actually value in these places, some like deep transformative value. And I am very proud of my students who do their die-ins and write their letters and raise hell and go off. And I have one student that was campaigning to tear down roads. You know, I hope I have a hand, I had a hand in that, maybe, I don't know. So once I sort of felt bad about it, and now I don't. And also, at Columbia, like our baseline intellectually as anthropologists is colonialism. That is not, we are not deniers. And we don't presume to speak for people. So in an environment like that, I actually feel pretty comfortable with claiming a transformative space, even. So.
I think in some ways that a question like that presumes some kind of dichotomy or bifurcation of the old categories of progress and savagery and progress and tradition when, like Jolene said, we're born into this, and the academy is not different from where I live on the Navajo Nation, and I go back and forth. I mean, our communities are just like, we've got all of these incredible contradictions and these incredible places that are at the one time beautiful and stark and wonderful and hard to live in, and so my work is for the Navajo Nation, whether or not they like it, whether or not they embrace it. I have these critical questions for my own people in ways of thinking about and raising our own critical consciousness, and I draw upon the work of my colleagues here, Indigenous feminisms, particularly critical Indigenous studies, and reframe it and think about it from a Navajo perspective. And so where I come from, it's full of contradictions and it's full of beauty, and I wouldn't live anyplace else. And how I got here into the academy, it was a really hard thing to do. I'm the first Navajo with a PhD in history. It was a really hard thing for me to do with a dog-eared reservation education. And so I am very unapologetic about being an academic. Sometimes my own people will dismiss me and say, well, you're just an academic. And I'm just like, I'm not going to apologize. What I have to contribute is what I have to contribute.
Thank you. Sorry.
Hi, I have a question. One of the linkages that I've seen is temporality. And I think all of your plenary papers did really beautiful theoretical work about theorizing the contemporary, right? So whether, Kim, when you touched on the fires and what's happening, or Jolene, the Biennale form, Jennifer, of course, all of the very, very recent violence that's been happening on the Navajo Nation, even this week, that's kind of come into public consciousness. And of course, Audra, everything that's happening with the Truth and Reconciliation. So if you guys could reflect on the role of time, the present, kind of what you see, how could different political projects maybe cohere, what Indigenous studies gives you that maybe your disciplinary boundaries do not, and yeah, I think that's it.
I have really excellent graduate students and undergraduate students, and they have just done incredible work in our part of the world in terms of melding theory with practice. You know, they're busy doing both, and we do it on an everyday basis. And you know, I don't know to what extent I have an influence on that, but sometimes the local organizers, when they start having conversations with some of the other Indigenous local organizing groups, one of them will challenge the groups that I'm part of and say, well, you know, and the famous thing to legitimate yourself is say, well, I speak for the elders, you know. The elders said this, and then nobody says anything. So then with the groups I work with, they'll say, well, where's your elder? You know, did your elder speak? They're like, oh yeah, here's Dr. Denetdale. You know, I'm looking around like, what the fuck are you guys talking about? You know? You know, so we do this work on the ground, and we're able, because of the interdisciplinary kind of work that we've been doing that looks at the structures of example of violence as normative, as violence as common sense, that the group that I work with can successfully reframe how we understand violence, for example. So when a couple of summers ago, this is ongoing work with a couple of graduate students, we went to Gallup, New Mexico, which just thrives on the poverty and the misery of Navajo people. We went around and talked to people, and it turns out that someone I had gone to high school with was homeless for 15 years in that town. So we were able, through essays, through our connections, to write a series of essays for Indian Country Today and successfully reframing how we understand violence against particularly Navajos in Gallup, for example. And then there was a Native American calling program on homelessness, I think it was, and people, you know, tend to individualize it, and then they not only individualize it, but they also say, you know, if you just heal, things will be okay. So I call my graduate students and I call friends, and they call into the talk show, and they successfully reframe it so that people can understand that this is part of settler colonialism. You know, so that's the way in which the people that I work with do, and it's just, you know, making those connections all the time.
So that was very helpful. Thank you, Jennifer. It also helped to hear about the work that you guys are doing over there with Melanie Yazzie and Nick Estes on border town violence, but also it reminded me of how crucial Indigenous studies has been for me also methodologically to think about history as it unfolds in the present. And it's partially Indigenous studies, and it's also, and the commitment to monitoring, staying alive to ongoing injustices in the present. So wherever that inequity is marked, or that injustice, or that moment, or that, it's not isolated. And then there's often something underpinning that. There's a pattern, there's a structure. This can come from anthropology, this can also come from this comparative historian, Patrick Wolf, who was a historian of anthropology, this idea of structure through time, logic. I think this is part of what invigorates the kind of critical mode of Indigenous studies in this moment, is this deep, acute attention to specificity in the present and its life through time. So these are not isolated incidences, right? This border town injustice that she's talking about, this racism against Navajos in border town, has a history of geographic history, for example, of being pushed out of community. And this has helped my analysis along hugely. Now I'm working on the murdered and missing women, what I see as the kind of performative travesty of the the idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission when colonialism is actually ongoing, right? It isn't over. So if I didn't have an understanding of process or structure or logic through time, then I wouldn't be able to chart that out and prove it, which I'm doing. I think I'm doing with this book. So I think that's the sort of it's not intersectional. It's this robust rapprochement between these fields that Indigenous studies, with its attention, vigilance over injustice, matters of sovereignty, etc., pushes, I think, to points that you don't see in other fields. So, and that has to do with the present, like looking at what's happening in the present, saying, this is not an isolated incident, right? This is something through time, and let me show you how. Anybody else on the present?
One of the things that that's a great question, and one of the things that I think about is that I do think that it's possible in the field of art history, if you don't stay within the boundary of the epistemological West, which of course is really a fraught category, to begin with. But if you allow yourself this sort of into the room to kind of solve problems, there's really nothing wrong with the way in which the methodological practice of the field works. But the histories for Indigenous art simply aren't in place. And so there's so much work to be done that I think that, that's, I guess, my focus at this point in time, is to add depth to each of these categories, because the focus hasn't been from the issues that we're interested in. And so I'll just share a quick example with you. So because Cornell is located within the homelands of the Cayuga people, and more broadly the Haudenosaunee, one of the things that I've been interested in is really revisiting the rhetoric of our tradition, if I can be so bold as to say that we all arrive at these sort of like conveniences. People talk about the Turo, they talk about the Great Law, they talk about the Tree of Peace, they talk about these, but they have no idea really what it means. And so I've been teasing out a simple thing like this idea of the symbol of this Tree of Peace, which is different than the celestial tree that I treated in the paper that I did here. And I was able to really work with an archaeologist, soil scientist, an education philosopher, a knowledge holder from the community who has deep knowledge in both Cayuga, Seneca, and the Onondaga language, and also the Mohawk language, and somebody who was really deeply involved in ceremony. And we just really spent time in one day and just had this amazing discussion around this one symbol, and we went very deep on this topic. And so that's the kind of opportunity, I think, being in academia, and this idea of this moment of a willingness to unfix the fixity of time. And we have to do this in order to locate Indigenous philosophy within the structure of the academy. And so it's like looking for a way to describe it to ourselves, as well as how to then build the intellectual bridges where necessary to open these ideas up. And so it's important to have colleagues that are with us that are open to these discussions. And it's a discussion, but at the same time, I can't agree more with Audra on the point that your colleagues or your cohort have to acknowledge colonialism. If that's not acknowledged, then the discussion is on a slippery slope. And I don't think we've really passed that threshold in the Americas, that it's just a basic kind of understanding of that's the platform that we're all negotiating from in some way.
it sounds like we are all a little tired after these days. At the beginning of each of our plenary speakers' presentations, we gave them a gift, and I hope that all of us are very grateful for the gifts of thought and experience and knowledge that they've brought to us. So first, I would like to thank all of them for being here and contributing to that. But even more importantly to me, the process of the planning of this entire conference became embedded in the strong Native community that we have here at UWM, especially the academics, but also the larger community there. Some of those people who are particularly important are here with us. Meg Noden is not, she's in Michigan today, but we still have Bernie Purley, so I'd like to thank him. Kim Blazer, Carrie Miller in the back row. And if any of you have felt even a faint touch of the richness and the contentiousness and the breadth of the scholarship that they bring here, I've had the privilege of feeling even more of it. And so they have welcomed all of you into their land, and I think we should leave here on that note of gratitude toward the larger Native communities which continue to exist here, and even in the face of colonialism, continue to show those levels of generosity to us. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for your energy and your time, and I'm very pleased that you could join us. Thanks.
Out of my mouth. I'm so sorry.